Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's Torah portion is Parshas Chayei, and most of it is taken up with the story of Eliezer, the servant of Avram Avinu, Abraham our father, going on a search to find a bride for Yitzchak. In the Parsha, Eliezer makes a deal with God. The first young woman I meet who offers to give me and my camels water, that's going to be the one. And then what happens? Rivka comes, offers to give him water and also for his camels, and there you go. Now, I actually had a lot of trouble with this episode. I started on a few different paths and none of them panned out. First, I tried Eliezer. I thought that would be cool, and I compiled a source sheet on Sefaria on Eliezer. Found all the things I could, and I found some interesting things, but it didn't go anywhere. So then I tried camels. Camels will be interesting, right? And I found a lot of different stuff in rabbinic literature about camels. I even found references to flying camels. But it turns out that flying camels is a deliberately absurd expression used by the rabbis in the Gemara to refer to something that's impossible. Which is kind of a bummer, because, flying camels would be fun. But at least we know where the line is. So I expressed this frustration to my wife, told her I couldn't figure out what to do, everything was a dead end, and she said, nose rings. And I mentioned this to my daughters, and they all unanimously agreed that the most interesting thing in this week's Parsha is nose rings. See, when Eliezer meets Rivka and realizes that she's the one, he gives her nose rings. Here's what it says in the Parsha. Vayihi ka'asher kilo ha'gemolim lishtois, vayikach ha'ish nezim zahav beka mishkalei, u'shnei tzimidim al yadeha asara zahav mishkalim. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekel. And then he asks who she is, and she tells him who her father is, and he realizes that she's from Avram's family. So my entire family is right, nose rings are cool, and that's where this week's rabbit hole is going to start.
Why can't we have nose rings?
Because nose rings are for punks, little mister.
So if you want to know more about nose rings in Torah, let's dive in. So the Hebrew word for nose ring is nezim. Eliezer gives Rivka a nezim, which is a nose ring, and that's cool. But maybe he didn't give her a nose ring. See, in some translations, it actually says earring.
You know what you could use, Alex? No, what could I use, Nick? An earring.
And later on in Chumash, during the story of the golden calf, the word is used very clearly to mean earrings. And this is what it says there. Vayomer aleim Aaron parku nizmei hazahav asher ba'oznei nesheichem. Aaron said to them, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives. So in that case, nezim very clearly means earrings. So maybe here in this case, when Eliezer gives Rivka a nezim, that also means an earring, which is significantly less cool. And it ends our rabbit hole where we started. This possibility of nezim being either an earring or a nose ring is brought up by Ibn Ezra. And he seems to prefer to interpret this as a nose ring because he starts explaining what a nose ring looks like. But the way he describes a nose ring is probably not what you're expecting. He says that a nezim that's worn on the nose is actually attached to the forehead and hangs down onto a person's nose. If you want to know what that looks like, there's actually a diagram of it in the fabulous new edition of the Chumash published by Open Book Press. So according to Ibn Ezra, a nezim is a nose thing, but not a nose ring. I am so sorry. Tzafnas Paneach, a commentary on Ibn Ezra's commentary, explains why Ibn Ezra describes the nezim this way, differently than we would normally think of a nose ring. So Ibn Ezra was famously a wanderer. He was traveling through most of his life. He was born in Spain, but had to leave, and then wandered around through Europe, where he composed most of his works. So according to Tzafnas Paneach, the commentary on the commentary, Ibn Ezra wrote this commentary while he was in Italy, and he had never been to the Middle East, where it's common for women to have nose piercings. So since he had never seen a nose ring in a pierced nose, he described this nose ornamentation that's part of a headdress. Now, I searched around to try to see if there was any examples of such a thing, but I couldn't find anything. If there are any people out there watching this who are experts in medieval European headdresses, please let us know in the comments what's going on. So according to that, the nezim probably was a regular nose ring, but Ibn Ezra just hadn't seen one yet. But according to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, he says that there's actually a logical reason why Ibn Ezra had to explain it that way. He says, according to Ibn Ezra, the problem was the weight of the jewelry itself, because the verse actually tells us how much it weighs. It says it weighed a half shekel.
Give me shekels, give me pesos, let me see their smiling faces.
So according to Yaakov Kamenetsky, Ibn Ezra thought that that would be too heavy to hang from a nose piercing. So he said it must have been a headdress with something hanging down onto the nose. So according to that interpretation, it's not just that Ibn Ezra had never seen a nose ring before, it's that he thought it wouldn't make any sense for her to be wearing something that heavy on her nose. But I looked it up, and a shekel is only about 11 grams, which means that half a shekel is just a little over 5 grams, which I don't think is particularly heavy for a nose ring. If anybody with personal experience with nose rings wants to chime in the comments, please feel free to correct me. So either way you cut it, whether it was a regular nose ring or some sort of nose ornamentation, it seems like Ibn Ezra and most other commentaries agree that it was a nose ring and not an earring. And the reason why that's pretty clear is because when Eliezer retells this story to Rivka's family a little bit later, he says very clearly, I asked her who she was, and then I put the nose ring on her nose and the bracelets on her hands. But you may have noticed that when Eliezer retold the story, he flipped it. See, when the Torah originally tells us the story, it says he gave her the nose ring and the bracelets, and then he asked her who she was.
Who are you?
But when Eliezer retells the story, he says he asked her who she was first, and then gave her the jewelry. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to you, but to all the commentaries, it is a big deal. Everybody addresses it. We'll start with Rashi, because hey, I think this is the furthest we've gotten into a video before we quoted Rashi. So according to Rashi, Eliezer flipped the order of events and said that he asked her first who she was and then he gave her the jewelry because he didn't want her father and brother to start asking questions. Like, hey, this guy just gave my daughter jewelry and decided that she's going to marry some guy without asking her any questions just because she gave camels water? But according to Rashbam, who is actually Rashi's grandson, he says things happen a little bit differently. According to him, it actually happened the way Eliezer told it, that first he asked her who she was and then he gave her the jewelry. But when the Torah told us the story the first time, it kind of smoothed things out so that we wouldn't interrupt the story with questions. So we got all the action out of the way, the camels drank, he gave her jewelry, and then we get the questions. So according to Rashi, it happened the way the Chumash tells us the first time around, and Eliezer's version is the modified one. And according to Rashbam, Eliezer's version of the story is how it actually went down, and the Torah is the one that modified it to make a better story. So based on this, you could ask the question, who's a better storyteller, Eliezer or God? But those aren't the only opinions. As I said, everybody deals with this question for some reason. According to Malbim, when Eliezer watched Rivka give water to all the camels, and the camels drank up all the water, and they finished drinking, and then she didn't ask for anything in return, Eliezer knew that she was the right person.
But you see, I have the other slipper.
And so he says, I don't think it's a big deal that he gave her the jewelry before he asked who she was, because he had all the information he needed. He knew he was in the right place, where Avram had sent him, and he knew that Rivka was a nice person. And that's all he needed to know. So when I was doing the research for this and I was looking at all the commentaries, I wondered, why is this such a big deal to everybody? Like, sure, fine, it's a little bit weird that there's two different versions of the story, but it seems like they all feel like it's really important. And I found another answer to this question from a commentary that's a compilation of things from the Bali Tosfos. So I tracked that down to Tosfos' commentary on Gemara, on the Talmud. And then it made sense to me why this might be a big deal. But first we have to back up. Remember I said at the beginning of the video that Eliezer made a deal. He said, the first young woman who comes along and offers to give myself and my camels water to drink, that's the one. There's a mitzvah not to do that. It's called Nachash, divination, and Gemara actually uses Eliezer as the prime example of it. It says any divination that's not like the divination of Eliezer and Yonasan is not divination at all. So apparently there's a story about Yonasan, Jonathan, making a sign for something, but I'm not going to get into that here. Here we're focusing on Eliezer. So Tosfos says you could have a question. According to opinions somewhere else in the Talmud, that this prohibition against divination and omens is not just for Jews but for non-Jews as well, then how could Eliezer, who was a good guy, have done this? Now before we get to the answer, I just want to point out that this is a wonderful example of Talmudic logic that I love. Like sure, there's a bajillion different ways to see everything, but it always has to be backwards compatible. So according to the opinion that non-Jews aren't allowed to follow omens, how did Eliezer make an omen and follow it? Because the Tana, the rabbi who made that opinion, knew that story, so he must have had a version of it that worked for him. And that's exactly what Tosfos says. According to that Tana, who has the opinion that non-Jews aren't allowed to follow omens, Eliezer asked her first who she was, and then gave her the jewelry. So now this whole thing makes sense. Tosfos gave it some stakes. If Eliezer gave her the jewelry without asking her any questions, then he was relying on the omen. If he asked questions first and then gave her the jewelry, then he wasn't relying on the omen. Now you might be thinking, okay, we've got nose rings, we've got omens, that's interesting stuff, because you know here at the Rabbit Hole we're all about practicality and relevance to daily life. But this question is actually extremely relevant at least once a year. So when I got to this stuff about divination and omens, I remembered something that I had read many years ago. When the Gemara explains this prohibition, one of the examples it gives is a weasel deciding whether or not to do something because you see a weasel do something. And ever since I saw that, I thought, that's Groundhog Day.
Punxsutawney Phil, the seer of seers, prognosticator of prognosticators.
So now this is getting real, because now we have to figure out if Groundhog Day is an Isser D'Oraisa, a biblical prohibition. I just want to make a disclaimer here. Nothing in any of these videos should be considered as anything close to halachic advice. If you have an actual halachic question about what to do practically, then research the subject matter yourself or consult with somebody who's already an expert. Now that that's out of the way, is Groundhog Day a biblical prohibition? The Kesef Mishnah, which is Yosef Karo's commentary on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, answers this question of how could Eliezer be practicing divination. He says it's only a problem if there's no reasonable connection between the two things. If there's no reason why this sign happening should have any bearing on the thing that you're trying to make a decision about. He says if it does have a reasonable causal connection, then that's just the way the world works. And he gives an example. If somebody says, if it's raining tomorrow, then I'm not going to go out. But if it's not raining tomorrow, then I will go out. That's not an omen, that's just the way the world works. And he says that's what Eliezer was doing. The sign that he was looking for is that the person would do something nice, and that's exactly what Rivka did, and therefore it made sense to him that she would be the right person. So according to this, Groundhog Day would only be a problem if there's absolutely zero scientific evidence for it. And unfortunately, that's exactly the case. There is absolutely no reasonable connection between the behavior of a groundhog and the weather.
This is one time where television really fails to capture the true excitement of a large squirrel predicting the weather.
And statistically, it's basically a coin toss. The groundhog isn't right more often than it's wrong. But I've got one more way to make Groundhog Day work. Rashi explains that an omen is a problem when a person actually depends completely on that event to make their decisions. And he says that's why Eliezer was used as an example, because Eliezer said if this person offers me and my camels water, then I will speak to her, and if she doesn't, then I won't speak to her. So this is bad news for Eliezer, but it could be good news for us. The way I understand Rashi here, Groundhog Day would only be a problem if the groundhog predicts an early spring, and based on that, you plan a picnic. And regardless of the weather, you make that picnic, even if it's raining or hailing or snowing or whatevering outside, because the groundhog saw its shadow or didn't see its shadow. I don't know how it works. I'm not a sorcerer. So to summarize, Eliezer may have given Rivka the nose ring before he asked her who she was, or he may have asked her who she was first and then given her the nose ring.
Are you?
And that could mean the difference between whether or not Eliezer was following an omen. And Groundhog Day might be a biblical offense punishable by lashes. But we've got one more explanation of the order of those events from the Shalah, and he explains it a lot differently from the other ones that we've seen. According to the Shalah, both versions of the story are true. She got the jewelry and then Eliezer asked her the questions, and he asked her the questions first and then gave her the jewelry. And the way that works is because of an angel. According to the Shalah, the Malach Matat, the angel Matat, was following Eliezer on this entire journey. Matat is the highest angel that there is, and it's so holy that we don't even say its full name because we're really scared of this angel. And if you look at this story in the Parshah, Eliezer is referred to by two different words throughout the entire story. Ish and Eved, the man and the servant. And according to the Shalah, when it says the servant, that's referring to Eliezer. But when it says Ish, that's referring to the angel, Matat. And so in this verse, when it says that the Ish gave her the jewelry before any questions were asked, this is from the perspective of Matat, the angel. And according to the angel, everything made sense, and the perception of time was different, as we've discussed in a previous video. And so from that perspective, the jewelry was already on her nose and hands, even though Eliezer hadn't asked her the questions and given her the jewelry yet. Now the Shalah uses a lot of Kabbalistic sources for his explanation, and this idea of including Matat may have come from the Zohar. But the Zohar takes it even further and shows us how the entire story can be read as referring to the revival of the dead in the future in the times of Mashiach. According to the Zohar, Eliezer during this entire story represents Matat, the angel. And this angel's job is going to be matching up the bodies with the right souls. So in the Chumash, when Eliezer was on a search to find a bride for Yitzchak, that means that the angel Matat is looking for a bride, a body, for Yitzchak, the soul. I'm not going to get into femininity and masculinity in Kabbalah, that's a different rabbit hole. So when Eliezer asks Rivka for water, water is a metaphor for knowledge. So the angel is asking the physical body to share its knowledge of God that it has obtained on earth that can only be obtained through doing mitzvahs and learning Torah. It's a really cool way to read this whole story. I recommend you look at the whole thing. But this rabbit hole is about nose rings. So when we get to the nose ring part of the story in the Zohar, this is what it says. It says when he put the nose ring and the bracelets on her nose and on her hands, that's the angel gathering up the bones from the grave and assembling them back together into the body. And after that, the body stands in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, and is ready to be enlivened once again by the soul. So according to the Zohar, this act of Eliezer placing the jewelry on Rivka represents the act of putting a person back together. Now, revival of the dead sounds pretty cool. By the way, I'm not using the term resurrection of the dead because I just don't feel like that sounds very Jewish. But I did want to say resurrection of the dead at least a couple of times so that the robots know what I'm talking about. Anyways, revival of the dead sounds cool, unless it's zombies, but it's not. It's good revival of the dead. But here's another practical question. We've got a lot of them on this week's rabbit hole. What happens if a person has been reincarnated, if a soul has inhabited many bodies throughout its soul life? Which body comes back? See, we're all down here learning Torah and doing mitzvahs because we got this prize coming, but maybe one of my other lives is going to get it. The Zohar actually asks this question a little bit later on in the Parshah. And this is what it says. It says, any body that didn't succeed, it's like it never was. And only the last body, the one that finishes what it was supposed to do here on earth, will be the one that comes back. So that's good news for you if you don't get reincarnated again. But even then, it's kind of a bummer because it would be cool to meet all your previous lives. But according to the Arizal, this means something different than we think it does. According to the Arizal, when a soul comes into a body, and the body and soul work together throughout that life to refine every aspect of the soul, if the body doesn't successfully refine every aspect of the soul, then only that aspect which it did successfully refine comes back into that body during the revival of the dead. And each part of the soul comes back into a different body, the body that refined that part of the soul. Which means, according to this, all of your past lives are all going to come back, and you can have a party. But you might be wondering, hey, all of these me's are going to be enlivened by like soul fragments and they're going to be weird zombie me's. Do I want that? That doesn't sound cool. The Lubavitcher Rebbe answers this question and he says, don't worry about it. Each part of the soul includes every other part of the soul. So every body will have a complete soul structure. It won't be a fragment, but each part will come from a specific aspect of the soul. And he gives an example to explain this. A person who lives their life and they're particularly good at the mitzvah of Ve'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. You shall love the Lord your God. Right? They're particularly good at loving Hashem. So that piece of the soul, the love part, that was fixed. That's ready. So that part will come back into that body. But that body will still be able to do everything else. It will be able to meditate on God's greatness. It will be able to have awe of Hashem. But that awe will be driven by love. So according to this, throughout its life, your soul has been many different people. And in the future, all of those different versions of you will come back. So we're almost done, but we haven't quite reached the bottom of the rabbit hole yet. This idea of being different people throughout your life and finding new ways to engage with the world and being Jewish brings us back to Groundhog Day.
The world's most famous weatherman, the Groundhog.
In case you don't know, there was a movie called Groundhog Day about a person who had to live the same day over and over again and figure out how he could be different despite the day being the same. The director and co-writer of that movie, Harold Ramis, was Jewish. And he said that that movie resonated with people of all religious backgrounds, but he had his own perspective on it as a Jew that I absolutely adore, and I want to share that with you now.
The one reason Jews respond to that idea is the Torah is read every year. Start at the same place on the same day. Every Jew in the world reads the same portion every day for the whole cycle, and then you start over. The Torah doesn't change, but every year we read it, we are different. Our lives have changed. We're older. We're different. We have children. We don't. Our relationships have changed, and you find new meaning in it as we change.
All right, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. If you have any questions you want to ask me in the comments, do that. If you have any things you want to correct me on, go ahead. If you have any more information about any of the things that I said, please put it in the comments. Okay, thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. If you see a weasel down here, please do not take it as an omen to find your way out. Just do it anyways, because it's dark down here.